see the warnings out there. We're running out of time with the climate crisis. Not enough action is being taken. We must implement change now or it will be too late. But what does that mean? What is it that we can expect in coming years if we do not take action? And is it just up to leaders to implement stronger policies? Do our actions as individuals actually make any difference? This is a series where we learn about the climate crisis, dig into the science behind it, and learn ways that each of us can accelerate action, specifically through our jobs. Because even though the problem is massive, we as individuals can actually help us change course. I'm Erin with the Hive Initiative, and this is Climate Workspace.
In our last episode, we talked with Marybeth Arcodia, who's a climate scientist, who helped us understand the background information on the climate crisis. She told us a bit about the IPCC, who they are, and the reports that they put out. And we talked a little bit about where we stand right now. This video is a continuation of our conversation, where we cover a little bit about what the Earth will look like if we continue on our current path. And also we cover what each of us can do to help change course. So just to recap, the main takeaway of the most recent report by the IPCC is that climate change is indisputably happening. Are there any other takeaways?
The main takeaway is the IPCC stance on climate change, which is the human influence is unequivocal. There's also some more important takeaways, which is the urgency of the problem. The report does state that adaptations have been taken across the globe. They applaud these efforts, both at the individual scale and at the larger scale. However, they do note that it's not enough. The adaptations are not strong enough and widespread enough to be counteracting the greenhouse gas emissions, the climate change that we've been seeing. They touch a lot on these climate resilient developments and adaptation and mitigation efforts that can push us in the direction of reaching these goals, the 1.5 C, the 2 degrees C. There's also a huge stress on the varying vulnerability of populations to climate change. A few more statistics from the report. The deadly heat stress is projected to increase from 30% of the population being affected today to 50 to 76% being affected at the end of the century, depending on different scenarios. If the world were to warm by 4 degrees by the end of the century, the number of days of stressful conditions for outdoor workers will increase to 250 days per year in some parts of South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central and South America. That's just heat stress. In addition, there's water scarcity due to climate change. With 2 degrees warming, we have about 800 million to 3 billion people at risk of water shortage. And if we increase the warming to 4 degrees Celsius, that moves up to 4 billion people on the planet. And that's with today's population. Depending on the amount of climate action, adaptation efforts that are taken, the number of people who are suffering from hunger in 2050 will range from 8 million to 80 million, depending on the different efforts that are taken. And again, the highest populations at risk here are in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Central America. What we're seeing are these compound issues due to climate change, with the already vulnerable populations becoming more and more vulnerable at a disproportionate rate.
With the likelihood of what we are seeing now and with the policies that have been set by policymakers and with companies doing what they're doing, what is the likely outcome that we will see in the near future, in 20 years, in 30 years, or by 2100?
The answer to that question is dependent on the action that is taken. The reason that we run climate projection scenarios is because we want to have an idea of if this range of adaptation and mitigation efforts is taken, these are the outcomes that we can expect. Now, the hope is that we show the business as usual scenario, which shows a steady and actually exponential increase in the Earth's temperature, and thus an exponential increase in compounded adverse effects from climate change. And so the hope is that we show this compared to a drastic reduction in emission scenario, drastic reduction in the temperature increase. We stay right around those pre-industrial levels, and we aren't facing these compounded impacts. That's the hope. What these projection scenarios are showing is that if we take this action, this is what we could see as the outcome. And again, there's a huge amount of uncertainty calculations that go into this. That's why you see those big envelopes in the curve. You often see between 4 to 6 different projection scenarios in those maps. Those are run based on economic scenarios of GDP increase. The business as usual scenario is currently the rate that we're following. About between the highest and the medium highest is approximately what we're following. That doesn't mean that we need to keep following those scenarios. The IPCC stance, and something that I firmly agree with, is that the solutions are out there. The action needs to be taken to follow the solutions that we have, to follow one of those lower projection scenarios as opposed to the business as usual or minimal adaptation and mitigation efforts taken.
And what are those things that need to happen?
So the IPCC notes that there have been adaptation and mitigation efforts worldwide. And what needs to happen is more of this at a much larger, at a much faster scale. There has been a lot more youth input and action taken for climate change, for climate adaptation than ever before. And so that's very optimistic. That gives a lot of hope for the future, that the younger generations are really taking this problem on. And they are also the ones who are going to be seeing more and more of those impacts, especially as we near the end of the century. The IPCC states that there's 2 main things that need to be happening here in the range of actions. So it's actions that reduce human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a large-scale and drastic mitigation of the greenhouse gas emissions. And then secondly is actions that transform the way that we live. So again, these adaptation efforts. So that puts humans on a sustainable pathway. We need both the mitigation and the adaptation hand in hand. Individual action is very important. And so some of these things are simply a reduction in the amount of plastic that you use. The reduce, reuse, recycle is a really good framework for anyone to be able to follow. And remember that they go in order. So to first reduce the amount of new materials that you're buying, especially plastic, single-use materials. Then to reuse what you already have. And then if you're not able to reduce or to reuse, then to recycle, to do more sustainable individual actions. Then further is the large scale action that needs to be taken. And so this is from a societal standpoint, and a lot of what the Hive Initiative is working towards, which is climate action at the workplace. And so instead of an individual reducing their carbon footprint, it's now an entire office building, an entire corporation. So now we're moving into hundreds, thousands of people reducing their carbon footprint. So this is exactly the type of action that's getting the larger scale mitigation and adaptation efforts. Another point that I will make here is that education and being informed on the issue at hand is key. The only impetus people will have to take action is if they understand and know the problem that's going on. Education of the individual, education of society, large scale, the impacts that can have, the benefits that can come from more sustainable pathways, more sustainable development is key. Again, the solutions are out there, they just need to be implemented.
In the next question, I asked Marybeth about a map that shows the Earth with 4 to 5 degree warming. I got this map from the channel Just Have a Think, and it's based upon another map first published in 2009 in the journal New Scientist, and is based upon research first published in the Royal Society Journal. I'll link all of those sources down in the description. I want to talk about an illustration of what the world could look like with a business as usual scenario and the resulting 4 to 5 degree Earth. A few of us have shown this image to a few people and they don't believe it. They're like, is this for real? Because it's shocking. The whole world is basically a desert. So I want to talk a little bit about this image and break down how the world can get to this point, how likely it is to get to an Earth looking like this, and then what it might mean for people around the world.
So the likelihood of this type of scenario is hard to quantify because that's again based on those adaptation and mitigation efforts, especially large scale. Another way to think of that is what is the likelihood that we will meet the goals set forth by the Paris Climate Agreement? Those types of questions are not quantifications that the IPCC makes because of human action that's needed for these types of quantifications. However, this type of scenario can easily be seen by following that business as usual scenario. If you were to think about it as minimal or even the same amount of effort that's already being taken with no increase, this is a likely scenario to see. And again, this graphic is highlighting those compound adverse effects from climate change, especially the food and water scarcity. The image is showing that it's only the Siberian region and the Canadian, Alaskan regions are the only places that food is able to grow. And with the rise in the Earth's population, just looking at this map and how much of the terrestrial Earth is able to grow food for the rest of the planet, there's clearly a disproportion. And then also, let's say we do have this type of scenario, how are we able to distribute the food that is grown in these regions to the rest of the world? I think this image is very good because it's showing what could happen and also really that multitude of impacts from climate change. And then also moving into the uninhabitable regions of the Earth. If we continue to move at the rate that we're moving, places in the Earth that people are living now will become uninhabitable.
So now it is a bit clearer, both the risks we face and the fact that we can change our future for the better. And because current commitments by governments are not strong enough to keep us in the blue scenarios, we can take it upon ourselves to push for the changes we want to see. The truth is, our greatest multiplying factor is at the place we spend most of our time, our jobs. It is our sphere of greatest influence, and it is the primary source of global emissions. If we push for action there, we will amplify its effect. So how do we do it? As Marybeth said, the solutions are out there. The rest of this series will focus on these solutions, on what we can do and how we can do it.
Let's do this.
Climate Workspace is a project of the Hive Initiative. We are committed to encouraging and supporting climate action in the workplace. Find more information and tips on our Instagram, LinkedIn, and at hiveinitiative.org.